Captain Samuel Wright adjusted his white belt nervously as he stepped into the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Academy for the first time. The sounds of bodies hitting mats and the controlled breathing of practitioners filled the air, creating an atmosphere that felt both welcoming and intimidating. At 38 years old, Samuel had dedicated his entire adult life to serving as a royal guard. But recent changes in the kingdom's security protocols had mandated that all guards receive training in modern combat techniques. The academy was unlike any training facility Samuel had experienced during his years of military service. Where army training halls were sterile and regimented, this place had character. Worn mats bore the impressions of countless training sessions, and the walls were covered with photos of competitions and promotions. Students of various ages and skill levels moved through drills with fluid precision that made the art look almost like a dance. "You must be the new guy from the Royal Guard," said a voice behind him. Samuel turned to see a young man in his early 20s, lean and athletic, wearing a blue belt around his waist. The belt signified intermediate skill. Samuel knew from his brief research into the sport's ranking system. "I'm Jake Morrison. I heard we were getting someone from the castle." Samuel nodded, feeling slightly out of place in his crisp white GI among the worn training clothes of the experienced students. "Samuel Wright, I appreciate you taking the time to help orient a complete beginner." Jake's smile carried a hint of condescension that Samuel recognized from his early days in military training. "Don't worry, we'll take it easy on you. Jiu-Jitsu isn't like the sword work you guys do up at the castle. This requires actual technique and timing." The comment stung more than Samuel cared to admit. During his years of service, he had earned respect through dedication and competence. But here, he was starting from zero. The other students were already pairing off for warm-up drills, moving through positions and transitions that looked impossibly complex to his untrained eye. Instructor Carlos Mendoza called the class to attention, his black belt worn and faded from years of use. The Brazilian accent in his voice was slight but noticeable as he addressed the assembled students. "Tonight we work on guard passing and submissions from side control." For those who are new, his eyes found Samuel and the group. "Focus on the fundamental movements. Don't worry about speed or power yet." The next hour proved to be one of the most humbling experiences of Samuel's life. Techniques that looked simple when demonstrated became impossibly complicated when he attempted them. His body, conditioned for the rigid discipline of military formations and ceremonial duties, struggled to adapt to the fluid movements that jiu-jitsu required. During partner drilling, Samuel was paired with different students throughout the class. Each interaction reinforced his beginner status as training partners easily escaped his attempts at control and smoothly transitioned through techniques he couldn't even recognize, let alone defend against. "Try to relax," advised Maria Santos, a purple belt who had been training for 5 years. "You're fighting against yourself as much as against your partner. Jiu-jitsu is about leverage and timing, not strength." Samuel appreciated the advice. But relaxation felt impossible when every movement required conscious thought and every position felt unstable. His military training had emphasized maintaining strong, balanced postures, but jiu-jitsu seemed to deliberately seek out awkward angles and uncomfortable positions as the class progressed to live sparring. Samuel found himself watching more than participating. The instructor had wisely suggested that complete beginners observe until they understood basic safety concepts. But the experience of sitting on the sidelines while others engaged in intense technical battles was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Jake Morrison was clearly one of the more skilled blue belts in the class, smoothly transitioning between positions and securing submissions with casual efficiency. During a break between sparring rounds, he approached Samuel with that same condescending smile. "Pretty different from marching around the castle in formation, isn't it?" Jake said, toweling off sweat from an intense roll with another blue belt. "This stuff takes years to really understand. Most people who start at your age never make it past white belt." Samuel absorbed the comment without response, but he filed it away alongside the other subtle discouragements he had encountered throughout the evening. The implication was clear. He was too old to set in his ways, and too unfamiliar with the sport to ever achieve real competence. After class, As students filtered out of the academy, Samuel lingered to speak with instructor Mendoza. The Brazilian had been encouraging throughout the session, offering specific technical advice and ensuring that Samuel felt included despite his obvious inexperience. "How did it feel?" Mendoza asked, his tone genuinely interested in Samuel's experience. "Humbling," Samuel replied honestly. "I've spent 20 years thinking I understood combat, but this is completely different from anything I've encountered." Mendoza nodded appreciatively. "That's a good attitude. Many people come in here thinking their previous experience makes them automatically good at jiu-jitsu. The learning process is difficult for everyone, but it's especially challenging for people who are used to being competent in other areas. Some of the other students seem to think I'm too old to really learn this properly," Samuel said. Voicing the concern that had been growing throughout the evening, "Jake said something to you?" Mendoza's expression suggested he was familiar with the young man's tendency toward arrogance. "Don't let him discourage you. I've seen plenty of people start later in life and achieve impressive skill levels. Age brings patience and discipline that younger students often lack." As Samuel drove back to his apartment near the castle, he reflected on the evening's experience. The physical challenges had been expected, but the social dynamics were more complex than he had anticipated. Some students had been genuinely welcoming and helpful, while others seemed to view his presence as an opportunity to demonstrate their superior knowledge. The Royal Guard. Training mandate required him to attend classes twice per week for 6 months, after which his progress would be evaluated to determine if continued training was beneficial. Based on tonight's experience, Samuel wasn't optimistic about impressing anyone during that evaluation. But something about the technical complexity of jiu-jitsu intrigued him, despite the difficult introduction. The art demanded problem-solving skills and adaptability that resonated with his military background. Even if the specific applications were entirely foreign, perhaps with dedicated effort and patience, he could overcome his late start and develop competence in this new discipline. The mocking comments and condescending attitudes would undoubtedly continue, but Samuel had faced skepticism before during his military career. Time would tell whether his determination and work ethic could overcome the disadvantages of age and inexperience in a sport that rewarded years of dedicated practice. 3 weeks into his jiu-jitsu journey, Samuel had developed a routine that began long before the academy opened its doors. Every morning at 5 o'clock, he would arrive at the Royal Guard training facility and spend 2 hours working. Through the movements and positions he had learned in class, the empty gymnasium allowed him to practice without the pressure of performing in front of more experienced students. The physical demands of jiu-jitsu had surprised him initially, but his military conditioning provided a solid foundation for the cardiovascular requirements of the sport. What challenged him more was the mental aspect, the chess-like strategy that governed every transition and submission attempt. Samuel found himself watching instructional videos during his lunch breaks, taking notes on technique details that escaped him during the fast-paced evening classes. His secret morning practice sessions were yielding gradual improvements that he could feel, even if others couldn't see them yet. His balance was becoming more stable in unfamiliar positions, and he was beginning to recognize common patterns in how techniques connected to each other. The movements that had felt impossibly awkward 3 weeks ago were starting to develop a natural flow. Jake Morrison continued to be Samuel's most frequent training partner, partly due to their similar size, and partly because Jake seemed to enjoy the opportunity to demonstrate his superior skill. During their drilling sessions, Jake would often pause to offer corrections that felt more like criticisms. "You're still thinking like a soldier," Jake said during one particularly frustrating drilling session. "All rigid and formal." Jiu-jitsu is about being fluid, adapting to what your opponent gives you. You can't just muscle your way through everything. Samuel accepted the feedback without comment, though he privately disagreed with Jake's assessment of his approach. The young man seemed to mistake Samuel's methodical learning style for inflexibility, not recognizing the deliberate progression that characterized military training methodology. The breakthrough came during ... During Samuel's 4th week of training, during a class focused on escaping from bottom positions, instructor Mendoza was demonstrating a series of hip escapes and bridge movements that created space for defensive techniques. The concepts clicked for Samuel in a way that previous lessons hadn't, connecting to principles of body mechanics and leverage that he understood from his weapons training. Excellent. Samuel Mendoza called out during partner drilling. You're starting to use your hips properly. See how much more effective that escape becomes when you create the angle first. The encouragement felt significant coming from an instructor who praised technical progress rather than natural athleticism. Samuel realized that he had been so focused on comparing himself to other students that he hadn't noticed his own gradual improvement. During the sparring portion of that class, Samuel was paired with a newer white belt named David, a college student who had started just 2 weeks after Samuel. The match was the first time Samuel had worked with someone at a similar skill level, and the difference was immediately apparent. Where? Previous sparring sessions had felt like desperate attempts to avoid inevitable submissions. This round developed into an actual technical exchange. Samuel found himself able to implement some of the escape and defense techniques he had been practicing, and even managed to achieve a few dominant positions before David could counter. Good work tonight, Mendoza said as the class concluded. I can see you've been practicing outside of class time. That kind of dedication makes a real difference in how quickly you progress. Jake overheard the comment and approached Samuel as they were packing up their gear. Private lessons are expensive, but I guess Royal Guards make decent money, he said with his characteristic smirk. I practice on my own, Samuel replied simply, not bothering to explain his morning routine. Really? Jake's tone suggested skepticism. Most people need qualified instruction to make any real progress. Practicing by yourself can actually reinforce bad habits if you don't know what you're doing. The comment revealed more about Jake's attitude than his understanding of learning processes. Samuel had encountered similar thinking during his military career. People who believed that formal instruction was the only path to competence. His experience had taught him that dedicated individual practice, guided by principles learned in class, could accelerate progress significantly as weeks turned into months. Samuel's improvement became undeniable, even to skeptical observers. His technique remained basic compared to advanced students, but his understanding of fundamental principles was developing depth that translated into practical application. More importantly, he was beginning to develop the calm, problem-solving mindset that characterized successful jiu-jitsu practitioners. The transformation was most evident during sparring sessions. Where he had once panicked when caught in submission attempts, Samuel now methodically worked through escape sequences. His defensive game became increasingly difficult for training partners to overcome, forcing them to execute techniques with greater precision than they might use against less prepared opponents. Jake's attitude toward Samuel began to shift as the Royal Guard's competence became harder to dismiss. The condescending comments continued, but they carried less confidence than before. During one memorable sparring session, Samuel managed to escape from a triangle choke attempt that Jake had secured, turning the position into a guard pass that earned approval from watching classmates. Lucky escape, Jake muttered as they reset for another round. Technique, corrected Maria Santos, who had been observing the exchange. He used proper hand positioning and hip movement. That wasn't luck. The validation from a purple belt carried weight in the academy's informal hierarchy, and Samuel noticed that other students began taking his progress more seriously. His training partners started offering more substantive technical advice instead of basic encouragement, treating him as someone capable of implementing sophisticated concepts. Samuel's notebook, which he maintained religiously after each class, had grown thick with technical details and strategic observations. He recorded not just the mechanics of techniques, but the contextual factors that made them successful or unsuccessful against different types of opponents. The analytical approach that had served him well in military planning was proving equally valuable in understanding jiu-jitsu strategy. He began to see patterns in how certain body types and temperaments approached problems, information that allowed him to anticipate reactions and prepare appropriate responses. During his 5th month of training, Samuel achieved his first submission during sparring. Catching a fellow white belt in an arm bar from guard position, the technique had been drilled countless times, but executing it successfully against a resisting opponent felt like a significant milestone. Clean technique, acknowledged Carlos Mendoza, who had been supervising the sparring session. You set that up well with your grips and positioning. As Samuel continued to progress, he became increasingly curious about testing his skills against higher-level opponents. The opportunity would come sooner than he expected, in a way that would surprise everyone at the academy, including Samuel himself. But for now, he was content to continue his patient development, secure in the knowledge that dedication and intelligent practice were overcoming the disadvantages of his late start in the sport. Samuel's transformation over 5 months had not gone unnoticed by the academy's more experienced practitioners. His methodical approach to learning and consistent improvement had earned quiet respect from instructors and senior students. Even if some, like Jake Morrison, remained skeptical of his ultimate potential, what none of them realized was that Samuel's military background had provided him with learning strategies that extended far beyond what was visible during regular class time, his morning practice. Sessions had evolved into comprehensive training routines that addressed not just technique repetition, but also conditioning specific to jiu-jitsu demands. Samuel had studied the physical requirements of the sport and developed supplementary exercises that improved his flexibility, core strength, and cardiovascular endurance in ways that directly supported his mat performance. The Royal Guard facilities provided resources unavailable to most civilian practitioners. Samuel had access to detailed video analysis equipment that allowed him to record and study his movements with scientific precision. He could identify subtle flaws in his technique execution and make corrections that might take months to discover through normal feedback methods. More significantly, Samuel's military experience had taught him how to learn complex physical skills under pressure. His years of weapons training, hand-to-hand combat instruction, and tactical scenario preparation had developed his ability to absorb and implement new information rapidly when properly motivated. The motivation came from an unexpected source during his 6th month of training. Captain Harrison Reed, Samuel's commanding officer in the Royal Guard, visited the academy to observe Samuel's progress as part of the mandated evaluation process. The visit coincided with a regular evening class that included several of the academy's most skilled practitioners. Captain Wright has been diligent in his attendance, Instructor Mendoza explained to Captain Reed as they watched Samuel warm up with the other students. His progress has been steady, though jiu-jitsu requires years of development to achieve real proficiency. Captain Reed nodded, observing Samuel's movements with the trained eye of someone experienced in evaluating martial skills. The kingdom's security requirements are becoming increasingly complex. Traditional combat training may not be sufficient for the threats our guards might face. The conversation took place within earshot of several students, including Jake Morrison, who was preparing for sparring with characteristic confidence. Jake's attitude toward the visiting official was respectful but carried subtle implications about the limitations of military personnel in civilian martial arts. With respect, Sir Jake addressed Captain Reed, Jiu-Jitsu is very different from military combat training. It requires years of specific practice to develop the sensitivity and timing necessary for advanced application. Captain Reed's expression remained neutral, but Samuel recognized the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated interest in the young man's assessment. And you believe Captain Wright lacks the necessary attributes for advanced development? I think he's done well for someone starting so late, Jake replied diplomatically, though his tone suggested limitations rather than potential. But there's a significant difference between basic competency and the level of skill needed for practical application. The exchange crystallized, something that had been building in Samuel's mind for weeks. He had been approaching his jiu-jitsu training with the same measured patience he brought to other military skills. But perhaps the situation called for a more direct demonstration of capabilities. During that evening's sparring session, Samuel found himself matched against progressively more experienced opponents as the rounds progressed. His defensive skills had developed to the point where he could survive against blue and purple belts for several minutes, earning their respect even when he couldn't threaten them offensively. Jake, Morrison was scheduled to spar with Samuel during the final round of the evening, an arrangement that had become routine over the past month. Their matches typically followed a predictable pattern. Jake would secure dominant positions and work methodically toward submissions, while Samuel focused on defense and escape, but something felt different as they faced each other on the mat. Samuel's usual pre-sparring nervousness was replaced by a calm focus that reminded him of the mental state he achieved during high-stakes security operations. His breathing was controlled, his movement felt fluid, and his awareness of Jake's positioning and intentions was remarkably clear. The match began conventionally, with Jake pulling guard and attempting to control Samuel's posture while working toward a sweep or submission. Samuel's defense was more active than usual, preventing Jake from establishing the dominant grips that typically controlled their exchanges. As the minutes passed, Jake's confidence began to shift toward frustration. Samuel was not only defending effectively, but beginning to create offensive opportunities of his own. His guard passing attempts, while not successful, were forcing Jake to work harder to maintain his positions. Time called Instructor Mendoza. Ending the round before either fighter could achieve a definitive advantage, Jake stood up with obvious annoyance. Having expected to secure at least one submission during the extended sparring session. "You're getting more defensive," he said to Samuel. Though the comment sounded more like criticism than acknowledgement of improvement, Samuel nodded acceptingly. But privately, he knew that something more significant had occurred during that round. His approach to jiu-jitsu had shifted from survival-focused defense to active problem-solving, engaging with techniques and positions in ways that created opportunities rather than simply avoiding disasters. Captain Reed had observed the entire sparring session with professional interest. As the class concluded and students began changing out of their training clothes, he approached Samuel with an expression that suggested the evaluation had revealed more than expected. "Your progress appears substantial," Captain Reed said quietly. "I'm curious about your assessment of the training value for practical applications." Samuel considered his response carefully. "The technical aspects are highly sophisticated, sir. The strategic thinking and physical problem-solving skills have applications beyond sport competition, and your confidence in implementing these skills under actual pressure?" The question addressed the core issue that would determine whether Samuel's jiu-jitsu training continued beyond the initial 6-month mandate. Samuel's answer would influence not just his own future training, but potentially the implementation of similar programs for other guards. "I believe the skills are transferable, sir, though the specific applications would require adaptation to different contexts." Captain Reed nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to observe some additional training sessions before making final recommendations. Would it be possible to arrange more challenging scenarios to better evaluate practical applications?" Instructor Mendoza, who had overheard the conversation, stepped forward with a suggestion that would change everything. "Actually, Captain, we have a visiting black belt next week who's conducting a seminar. He often demonstrates techniques by working with students of all levels that might provide exactly the type of evaluation you're looking for." The proposal created an opportunity that none of them fully anticipated. Samuel would soon face a test that would reveal capabilities he hadn't even realized he possessed, transforming not just his own understanding of his skills, but the perception of everyone who had underestimated the quiet Royal Guard's potential. The week leading up to the visiting black belt seminar created an atmosphere of anticipation throughout the academy that Samuel had never experienced before. Professor Miguel Santos, a third-degree black belt from Brazil, was renowned not only for his technical knowledge, but for his ability to expose the gaps in students' understanding through practical demonstration. Samuel learned from the other students that Professor Santos had a reputation for selecting training partners based on their willingness to engage seriously rather than their rank or experience level. His seminars typically included sparring sessions where he would work with students to illustrate the concepts he had been teaching, often revealing weaknesses that weren't apparent during regular training. "Santos doesn't go easy on anyone," Maria explained during one of their training sessions. "He believes that true learning only happens when you're forced to problem-solve under real pressure. I've seen him submit black belts in seconds when they get overconfident. The information both excited and concerned, Samuel. His progress over 6 months had been steady, but he had no illusions about his skill level relative to a world-class practitioner. However, his military experience had taught him that sometimes the most valuable learning opportunities came from facing challenges that seemed beyond his current capabilities. Jake Morrison's attitude toward the upcoming seminar reflected his characteristic confidence mixed with nervous energy. As one of the Academy's more skilled blue belts, he clearly hoped to make a positive impression on the visiting professor. "I'm looking forward to working with someone at that level," Jake told the group during post-training conversation. "It's not often we get to train with world-class practitioners. Should be interesting to see how different skill levels handle the pressure." His comment was directed generally, but carried an obvious implication about Samuel's likely performance against such elite opposition. Samuel absorbed the subtle challenge without response, though he found himself increasingly curious about how his own skills would measure against truly advanced technique Captain Reed had arranged to attend the seminar. As part of his extended evaluation of Samuel's progress, the presence of his commanding officer added another layer of pressure to an already significant event. Samuel realized that his performance would influence not just his own continued training, but potentially affect military training policy for other guards. The morning of the seminar, Samuel arrived at the academy early to find Professor Santos already on the mats, moving through a solo drilling routine that displayed technical precision Samuel had never witnessed in person. Every movement was economical and purposeful, demonstrating the kind of mastery that only came from decades of dedicated practice. "You must be the guard everyone has been telling me about," Professor Santos said, noticing Samuel's early arrival. His English carried a slight Brazilian accent, but was perfectly clear. "Carlos tells me you've made impressive progress for someone starting so late." Samuel felt honored. His training had been discussed with the visiting professor. "I appreciate the opportunity to learn from your instruction, Professor. I understand you have extensive experience with practical applications." Professor Santos smiled at the diplomatic phrasing. Jiu-Jitsu is Jiu-Jitsu, whether it's in competition, self-defense, or military situations. The principles remain the same, but the context changes how you apply them. We'll explore some of those differences today. As other students arrived and the seminar began, Professor Santos demonstrated advanced concepts that built upon the fundamental techniques Samuel had been learning. His explanations were detailed and precise. But what impressed Samuel most was the professor's ability to adapt his instruction to different learning styles and experience levels. The technical portion of the seminar covered guard retention, submission setups, and transition timing that were several levels beyond what Samuel typically encountered in regular classes. However, his analytical approach to learning allowed him to understand the underlying principles even when the specific applications were too advanced for immediate implementation. When Professor Santos announced that the session would conclude with demonstration sparring, Samuel felt the familiar pre-competition focus that characterized his approach to high-pressure situations. His military training had conditioned him to perform better under stress rather than being overwhelmed by it. "I'll work with several students to show how these concepts apply under resistance," Professor Santos explained. "The goal isn't to submit everyone quickly, but to demonstrate how proper technique can overcome size, strength, and athletic advantages." Jake Morrison was among the first students selected, and their exchange illustrated exactly what the professor had described. Despite Jake's skill and athleticism, Professor Santos controlled every aspect of their interaction, transitioning smoothly between positions and maintaining dominant control. Without apparent effort, the demonstration was educational rather than competitive. With Professor Santos explaining his choices and reactions throughout the exchange, Jake performed respectably, defending intelligently and creating a few opportunities. But the skill gap was obvious to all observers. Several other students worked with Professor Santos, each exchange revealing different aspects of advanced technique and strategy. Samuel watched carefully, analyzing the patterns and principles that remained consistent, regardless of the specific techniques being applied. When Professor Santos invited Samuel to participate, The atmosphere in the room shifted noticeably. Captain Reed leaned forward with increased attention, and several students exchanged glances that suggested they expected this to be an educational but brief demonstration. Let's see how your military background influences your approach to problem solving, Professor Santos said as they faced each other on the mat. Samuel felt the familiar, calm focus settle over him as they engaged. His breathing remained controlled, his movement felt natural, and his awareness of Professor Santos's positioning and intentions was remarkably clear. The nervousness he had expected was replaced by analytical curiosity about how his skills would match against this level of opposition. The initial exchanges followed expected patterns, with Professor Santos establishing grips and controlling the pace of engagement. However, Samuel's defensive responses were more sophisticated than anyone anticipated, forcing the professor to use more advanced techniques than he had needed against other students. As the minutes passed, something unexpected began to develop. Samuel's military conditioning and analytical approach to technique were allowing him to not just survive but actively engage in technical exchanges with one of the world's finest practitioners. Professor Santos's expression shifted from instructional patience to professional interest as Samuel continued to present increasingly complex problems. The Royal Guard was not just defending competently, but beginning to create offensive opportunities that demanded serious technical responses. The room grew quiet as students and instructors realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Samuel, the white belt, who had been mocked for his awkward beginning, was engaging in a technical battle with a world-class black belt that was revealing capabilities no one had suspected he possessed. The technical exchange between Samuel and Professor Santos had exceeded everyone's expectations, lasting nearly 10 minutes of continuous engagement where the visiting black belt was forced to use increasingly sophisticated techniques to maintain control. What had begun as a demonstration was evolving into something that approached a legitimate competitive match. Samuel's performance defied everything Academy students thought they understood about skill development and learning curves. His defensive sequences were not just technically sound but tactically intelligent, forcing Professor Santos to constantly adjust his approach in ways that hadn't been necessary with other training partners. Interesting, Professor Santos murmured as they briefly disengaged to reset their grips. His tone carried professional respect rather than instructional patience. Your understanding of distance and timing is much more advanced than your belt rank would suggest. The comment sent ripples of astonishment through the watching students. Professor Santos was known for his precise assessments of technical ability, and his acknowledgement of Samuel's skills carried weight that transcended normal academy politics. Jake Morrison watched with visible confusion as the exchange continued. His certainty about Samuel's limitations was being systematically dismantled by evidence that contradicted months of assumptions. The Royal Guard, who had struggled with basic techniques, was now implementing advanced concepts that Jake himself was still learning. Captain Reed observed the demonstration with professional fascination, recognizing elements of Samuel's approach that reflected military training principles. The patience, analytical thinking, and ability to perform under pressure were familiar qualities that had been channeled into an unfamiliar application. As the sparring continued, Samuel began to display offensive capabilities that surprised even Professor Santos. His attacks were methodical and well-timed, creating legitimate submission threats that demanded serious defensive responses. The professor was no longer demonstrating techniques on a cooperative partner, but engaging in a technical battle that required his full attention. Guard pass, Professor Santos announced as he successfully moved to side control. But Samuel's immediate response was a textbook escape that returned them to neutral position. The sequence drew appreciative murmurs from experienced students who recognized the difficulty of escaping from such a skilled opponent. The breakthrough moment came during Samuel's 7th month of training, but it manifested in those crucial seconds when everything aligned perfectly. Professor Santos had secured what appeared to be a dominant position, working methodically toward a submission that seemed inevitable given the skill gap between but Samuel's military training had taught him that. Desperate situations often contained hidden opportunities. For those calm enough to recognize them, as Professor Santos adjusted his grips to tighten the submission, Samuel spotted a momentary opening in the professor's base and leverage. The counterattack happened with explosive precision that caught everyone off guard, including Professor Santos. Samuel used a combination of hip movement and grip manipulation that he had developed during his solitary morning practice sessions. Techniques that incorporated principles from his weapons training adapted to Jiu-Jitsu applications in 13 seconds. Samuel transitioned from defensive survival to offensive dominance, securing a submission that Professor Santos had no choice but to acknowledge by tapping out. The academy fell completely silent as students and instructors processed what they had witnessed. Professor Santos sat up with an expression of genuine surprise and admiration. "That was exceptional," he said, his voice carrying none of the condescension that often characterized interactions. Between advanced practitioners and beginners, that counterattack showed sophisticated understanding of timing and leverage. "How long did you say you've been training?" 6 months, Samuel replied, though his own voice reflected disbelief at what had just occurred. The professor shook his head with obvious amazement. "I've been training for over 20 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've been caught by something that creative from someone at your experience level." Jake Morrison stared in stunned silence, his worldview fundamentally altered by witnessing Samuel's performance. The mocking comments and condescending attitude that had characterized their interactions were suddenly revealed as embarrassingly misguided assessments of Samuel's true capabilities. Instructor Mendoza stepped forward with an expression that mixed pride and astonishment. "Samuel, that was incredible. I knew you had been progressing well. That level of technical sophistication usually requires years to develop." Samuel felt overwhelmed by the positive attention after months of subtle discouragement. "I've been practicing extensively on my own time," he explained. "Military training taught me how to analyze complex problems and develop systematic solutions." "Professor?" Santos stood and offered his hand in a gesture of professional respect. "Your approach to learning is remarkable. You've somehow compressed years of development into months through intelligent analysis and dedicated practice." Captain Reed approached the group with obvious satisfaction. "Captain Wright, this demonstrates exactly the kind of adaptive problem-solving skills that modern security work requires. Your continued training is not just approved but strongly recommended." As the seminar concluded and students began discussing what they had witnessed, Samuel realized that his relationship with the academy had fundamentally changed. The respect he had earned through his submission of Professor Santos extended far beyond that single technique to encompass recognition of his overall approach to learning and development. Jake Morrison approached Samuel as they were changing out of their training clothes, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity. "I have to ask, how did you develop those skills so quickly?" "That counterattack was something I would expect from a brown belt, not someone who's been training for 6 months. Samuel considered his response carefully. "I think military training taught me to approach learning differently than most people. Instead of just practicing techniques, I study the principles behind them and look for connections to things I already understand in the morning practice sessions. I practice every day, working through problems systematically until I understand not just how techniques work, but why they work and when to use them." Jake nodded with new understanding. "I guess I underestimated what systematic training could accomplish. Maybe I should reconsider my own approach to development." The transformation in Jake's attitude represented a broader shift in how the academy's students viewed Samuel. He was no longer the awkward beginner who had stumbled through his first classes, but a practitioner whose unique background and approach to learning had produced extraordinary results. Professor Santos gathered the entire class before departing, delivering final observations about the day's training. "Today you witnessed something special," he said, his attention including but not focusing exclusively on Samuel. "You saw how dedication, intelligent analysis, and systematic practice can overcome apparent limitations. Remember this lesson in your own development." As students dispersed, and the academy returned to its normal routine, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment of recognition. The mocking comments and condescending attitudes that had characterized his early training experience had been transformed into respect and curiosity about his methods. 6 months after the seminar that changed everything, Samuel stood before a group of royal guards in the castle's newly constructed combat training facility. The room had been specifically designed to accommodate Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instruction. With high-quality mats and equipment that reflected the kingdom's commitment to modernizing security training programs, Samuel now wore a blue belt around his waist, a promotion that had come faster than anyone at the academy had thought possible. Professor Santos had personally recommended the advancement during a follow-up visit, citing Samuel's exceptional technical development and his unique ability to adapt military principles to jiu-jitsu applications. Gentlemen, Samuel addressed the assembled guards. Today, we begin integrating modern grappling techniques into our comprehensive security training. These skills will enhance your effectiveness in close-quarter situations where traditional weapons may not be appropriate or available. The 20 guards before him represented the kingdom's elite security personnel. Men who had served with distinction in various capacities. Some were veterans of Samuel's own unit. Others came from specialized divisions responsible for protecting foreign dignitaries and high-value targets. All of them looked at Samuel with the respect that his recent achievements had earned. Captain Reed stood at the back of the room, observing the inaugural session of what had become known as the Royal Guard Advanced Combat Program. Samuel's success at the Civilian Academy had convinced military leadership that jiu-jitsu training could provide significant tactical advantages for security personnel operating in complex urban environments, sir, asked Sergeant Martinez, a 15-year veteran known for his direct communication style. How do these techniques compare to the hand-to-hand combat training we've already received? Samuel appreciated the question because it addressed the natural skepticism that any new training program would encounter from experienced professionals. Traditional military combat training focuses primarily on strikes and weapon retention, he explained. Jiu-Jitsu adds control and restraint options that are essential for security, work involving civilians and diplomatic situations. To demonstrate his point, Samuel called Martinez forward to serve as a training partner. The sergeant was larger and stronger than Samuel, with extensive experience in military combat training that made him a formidable opponent in any physical confrontation. Sergeant, please attempt to tackle me as if you were trying to subdue a suspect, Samuel instructed. Martinez approached the drill with professional seriousness. Using techniques that had been drilled into him through years of military training, his attack was direct and powerful, the kind of approach that would typically overwhelm most opponents through superior size and aggression. But Samuel's response demonstrated exactly why jiu-jitsu had proven so valuable in real-world applications. Instead of meeting force with force, he redirected Martinez's energy and used the sergeant's momentum against him. Within seconds, Martinez found himself controlled on the ground in a position where Samuel could maintain dominance while keeping his hands free for other tasks. Notice that I'm not trying to hurt Sergeant Martinez, Samuel explained to the watching guards. The goal is control and compliance, not injury. This distinction is crucial for security work where excessive force can create legal and diplomatic complications. The demonstration had the desired effect on the assembled guards. They could see immediately how these techniques would enhance their capabilities in situations requiring precise application of force. More importantly, they were witnessing instruction from someone whose credentials they couldn't question. Samuel's reputation had spread throughout the Royal Guard after his performance against Professor Santos. The story of the white belt who had submitted a world-class black belt in 13 seconds had become legendary, inspiring both respect and curiosity about his training methods. Over the following weeks, Samuel's classes became the most popular training sessions in the Royal Guard curriculum. His teaching style combined the analytical approach that had served him well as a student with practical applications that addressed real-world security, challenges the transformation in his relationship with Jake Morrison, had been particularly significant. The young man who had once mocked Samuel's abilities now sought him out for private instruction. Hoping to learn the systematic approach that had produced such remarkable results, I've been thinking about what you said regarding military training principles, Jake said after one of their training sessions at the civilian academy. I realize I've been approaching jiu-jitsu more like a hobby than a serious study. Could you help me develop a more structured practice routine? Samuel was happy to share the methods that had served him well, recognizing that Jake's natural athleticism combined with systematic training could produce exceptional results. Their relationship had evolved from antagonistic to collaborative. With Jake becoming one of Samuel's most dedicated students, the civilian academy had also benefited from Samuel's success. Instructor Mendoza had incorporated several of Samuel's analytical training methods into the regular curriculum, helping other students accelerate their development through more systematic practice approaches. Your influence on our training culture has been remarkable, Mendoza told Samuel during one of their regular conversations about curriculum development. Students are approaching their practice with much more intentionality and focus than before. Professor Santos had maintained contact with Samuel, periodically checking on his progress and offering advanced instruction during return visits to the kingdom. Their relationship had evolved into something approaching professional collegiality, with the professor often seeking Samuel's insights on adapting jiu-jitsu techniques for military and security applications. You've developed something unique, Professor Santos observed during one of his visits. Your approach combines the best aspects of traditional jiu-jitsu with practical applications that address real-world requirements. This could influence how the art develops in security and military contexts. The recognition from such a respected authority validated Samuel's belief that his military background had contributed something valuable to jiu-jitsu rather than simply limiting his learning potential. His success had demonstrated that different learning approaches could achieve exceptional results when applied with dedication and intelligence, as Samuel continued to develop both as a practitioner and instructor. He reflected on the journey that had transformed him from a mocked beginner to a respected teacher and innovator. The experience had taught him that expertise could come from unexpected sources and that systematic approach to learning could overcome apparent disadvantages of age and late starts. The Royal Guard program had expanded beyond initial expectations, with other kingdoms requesting information about Samuel's training methods. His techniques were being studied and adapted by military and security organizations across the region, spreading the influence of his systematic approach to jiu-jitsu development. Standing in the castle training facility, watching his students work through techniques that combine traditional jiu-jitsu with practical security applications, Samuel realized that his greatest achievement wasn't the 30-second submission that had shocked everyone at the academy. It was the development of training methods that could help others achieve their own exceptional results through dedicated, intelligent practice. The mockery and condescension that had characterized his early training experience had been completely transformed into respect and recognition. More importantly, Samuel had discovered that true mastery came not from individual achievement, but from the ability to help others unlock their own potential through systematic, purposeful development. His story had become an inspiration throughout the kingdom's military, proof that dedication and intelligent analysis could overcome any apparent limitation. The Royal Guard, who had been mocked for his awkward beginning, had become the instructor whose methods were revolutionizing how elite security personnel approached combat training.